Did you know that France is the country with the largest maritime exclusive economic zone in the world? Take a look at this map. We are talking about no less than 11,691,000 square kilometers of sea in which France has full exclusivity to exploit fishing, mineral, and energy resources. These are waters in which it can basically do whatever it wants. And don't tell me that it's not surprising that a country like France is the country with the most exploitable waters in the world. If we were to compare the area of these waters to a country, we could say that they are larger than the United States and 18 times the size of France's European landmass. Of course, more than 96% of these waters, spread all across the globe, are located beyond the country on the European mainland that we all identify as France. Don't you find this curious or surprising? Obviously, the question we're all wondering is, where does such a maritime domain come from? Well, I think it's no secret that France had a huge and intense colonial past. A past thanks to which it still retains territory scattered all over the globe. America, Africa, Oceania, and even a huge exclusive territory for research in Antarctica. With the exception of Asia, the French have territories on every continent on the planet. And since each coastal territory is entitled to some 200 miles of exclusive economic zone, the result is as we have just described. These overseas territories are, so to speak, strategic enclaves that give the French Republic a vast international projection. Let's not forget that, in addition to the issue of exclusive economic zones, these overseas territories are also strategic for many other reasons. Let's say that these places allow France to extend its military activity throughout the world, and also reinforce its geopolitical influence. For example, they make France the only European power to own territories in the Indo-Pacific. They are key to France being the country in the third largest military footprint in the world after the United States and Russia. Another example is Kougou in French Guiana, where the spaceport of ESA, the European NASA, is located from where all the European agency's space rockets are launched. Of course, at this point, there are a few questions we could ask. To what extent are these territories really part of France? Do they have a similar standard of living? Are they happy to remain part of the French Republic? How does Paris treat them? Well, VisualPolitik fans, in this video, we'll try to get to know the most unknown side of France a little better. And for that, we need to take a look at 4 of its most important overseas territories. This is what remains of the former French Empire. Check it out.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
If anyone thought that the official motto of the French Republic was being followed to the letter, I'm sorry to tell you that you're kind of wrong. At least as far as égalité, equality, is concerned, when we consider almost 3 million French people who do not live in metropolitan France in old Europe, but thousands of kilometers away. French people who, in many cases, are starting to get kind of angry with their situation. And there is no shortage of reasons for this. But before we get into that, just a quick aside. Have you heard about our exclusive weekly bulletin for patrons? Have you heard about VisualPolitik's exclusive products that are not for sale anywhere else? Would you like to receive exclusive videos on a regular basis? Well, if you like what we do and you want to help us keep growing and improving, you can find all this and more in VisualPolitik's Patreon community. We'll leave the link in the description below. But having said that, let's move on to today's topic, the French. And if you like, let's start by looking at the wallet. If there is one thing that characterizes the French overseas territories, it is their poor socioeconomic conditions. In overseas France, poverty rates are much higher than in metropolitan France. For example, while in European France the percentage of the population below the poverty line is around 15%, in the other territories of the Republic, the figure soars. For example, in Mayotte, the poverty rate stands at 77.3%, in French Guiana at 52.9%, in Guadeloupe at 34.5%, and in Martinique at 28.6%. But since poverty rates are quite relative, what happens if we look at, for example, at GDP per capita? Are there also differences? Well, the truth is, yes. The wealthiest French overseas territory, Réunion Island, has a GDP per capita of about $25,000, while the poorest department of metropolitan France has a GDP per capita of about $31,500. That's 26% higher. To top it off, these places are highly dependent on euros emanating from France's public budget, and more recently, also from European Union funds. This is a situation that has much to do with the lack of economic freedoms and decentralization endured by these territories. Unlike London, which has historically given full freedom to its overseas territories, Paris has taken a very different path. It makes no sense that the bulk of the laws, including tax legislation, trade rules, and much of France's regulations apply in places as remote, as different, and in some cases as poor as their overseas territories. Yes, it is true that in the year 2000, a small-scale decentralization was carried out, which means that these territories have some rules and laws that are different from the metropolis, and also have some tax incentives. But it's not nearly been enough. Yes, in some cases, such as New Caledonia, they even have their own legislative chambers. But apart from a few exceptions, everything ends up going through Paris. This is something that goes back a long way. In fact, these territories have a very low degree of commercial integration with any entity other than France, a situation inherited from the principle of exclusivity that forbade French colonies any commercial relationship with foreign countries, thus leaving it a metropolis a commercial monopoly over its colonies. Their economic backwardness is also related to their slave-owning past, which resulted in enormous hyper-specialization of the economies of these places and low value-added activities, such as the production of sugarcane, bananas, cotton, or cocoa. But the economic gap is not the only gap between French people that we're going to find. We are talking about significant political and social differences that, in some cases, are even threatening France's own sovereignty. Check this out.
New Caledonia, independence in sight?
New Caledonia is a French territory located in an archipelago of dozens of islands in a wonderful part of the world known as the South Pacific. Along with French Polynesia, they are the two French territories with the most autonomy and the only two listed by the UN as non-self-governing territories that in one way or another are pending decolonization. That is, they are pending a referendum to decide whether they opt for independence or to remain with France with a certain degree of self-government. In the case of New Caledonia, is special. In 1998, the Nome Accord was concluded, transferring certain powers from the French government to the outlying French collectivity. And it was also agreed to hold several independence referendums that took place in 2018, 2020, and 2021. Referendums which, by the way, the overwhelming majority voted in favour of remaining part of France. Now, why do we say that the case of New Caledonia is special? Well, you see, the reality is that there is a lot to be said on the subject of referendums. A good proportion of the New Caledonians in favour of independence from France did not participate in these referendums in order to try and boycott and delegitimise them by means of very low quorums.
Pro-independence movement in New Caledonia rejects legitimacy of no vote.
And so, in the last referendum, held in 2021, the no to independence vote won with 96.5% of the votes. However, turnout was only 44%. In other words, it would be reasonable to think that roughly the other half of the population was not in favour of remaining part of France. The explanation for such a discontent probably has a lot to do with the feeling of being a third-rate citizen and not having the capacity to change anything.
The poorest part of France.
New Caledonia is not the only French overseas territory that feels, to a certain extent, marginalised by the metropolis. There is also the case of Mayotte, a French island roughly half the size of New York City, nestled between Madagascar and Mozambique, which is by far the poorest French territory. Mayotte was one of the 4 Comoros islands that voted to remain part of France in 1974, while the other 3 formed an independent state, which, by the way, has not really fared well either. Despite being part of France and having spectacular scenery, crystal clear turquoise waters and lush green mountains that delight tourists, in Mayotte, a good proportion of the population lives in substandard housing and a large number of streets don't even have asphalt. Despite this, its situation is considerably better than that of the rest of the Comoros Islands, from where a large number of immigrants originate. The idea of being part of France and the European Union has attracted many of them to Mayotte, where they point that, to date, only 45% of Mayottans were born in the island, and 70% of children born in the capital were born to foreign mothers. Economic problems and a lack of opportunities are compounded by social problems of all kinds, including growing insecurity, which explains news stories like this one.
Mayotte unrest. French island residents round up foreigners. A group of residents from the Indian Ocean French island of Mayotte has been rounding up suspected illegal migrants and taking them to local police.
Of course, all of this translates politically into headlines like this one.
Marine Le Pen in the head of Mayotte. Breakthrough for Jean-Luc Mélenchon and punishment vote against Emmanuel Macron.
Yes, it may surprise you, but in the French territories of Africa, Le Pen wins. And what is the French government doing to try to change things? Well, basically, nothing, except the old formula of releasing more and more money. This, far from nurturing development, has made the island, as is the case with the rest of the territories, immensely dependent on the metropolis, which has made the island a retirement department of France. Without subsidies from France, in many of these territories, they would not even be able to meet the most basic needs. It is a question of models. If, on the one hand, you have to comply with all the cumbersome bureaucracy and endless regulations from France that make it difficult to have competitive companies, and, on the other hand, the metropolis showers you with money to finance all kinds of social services, what do? It's a question of incentives. You specialize in trying to get more and more money. You become a rentier of the public budget. But that was the case of Mayotte. Let's continue.
Caribbean France.
From Mayotte, we can cross half the globe and land back in France, specifically in the Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint Barthélemy, and Saint Martin. Of all of them, Guadeloupeans and Martinicans are perhaps the least satisfied with their status. A good chunk of the population feels discriminated against by Paris. An example? Well, we have the case of a pesticide. Yes, a pesticide that caused quite a stir in Guadeloupe and Martinique a few years back. You see, chlorderone is a pesticide that was widely used in banana plantations. The problem is that it turned out to be toxic. So far, let's say everything is normal, like things that haven't happened everywhere. What is not so normal is that France approved its use in Guadeloupe 2 years after it was declared potentially carcinogenic by the World Health Organization in 1979. Nor does it seem so normal that, sometime later, it was discovered that a parliamentary investigation in the neighboring island of Martinique, where this pesticide was also used, determined that France had been aware of the toxicity of this chemical since 1969 and still did not prevent this overseas territory from using it intensively. Obviously, this sort of thing does little to create a sense of belonging to the French nation. In this move, the most widespread perception of these places is that their lives don't count for anything to the bureaucrats in Paris. Of course, this perception comes from long ago, something deeply rooted in the local worldview, its slave-owning past, and what happened with its abolition. When slavery was abolished, France compensated slave owners for the loss suffered. This is something that is engraved in the local identity. And we could go on with many more examples. Economic, social, and belonging problems are common in most of these territories. And the explanation is that the metropolis has kept them on a leash. If these territories had had more freedom and more power, some of them could have exploited the legal and political security that comes with being part of a country like France to become financial, tourist, or even industrial enclaves, which is, in contrast, what has happened with many British overseas territories, from Gibraltar to Bermuda to Hong Kong itself. What's more, the inability of Paris to deal with social problems such as violence, lack of security, and illegal immigration in these areas should have convinced the French government long ago that decentralization was the best and perhaps the only possible solution in these cases. It makes no sense that these places located thousands and thousands of miles from France depend on Paris for practically everything. And it also doesn't make sense that the French have replaced economic freedom with subsidies and aid. But, VisualPolitik fans, we are talking about France, perhaps the most centralist and interventionist country in all of old Europe. The question is now over to you. What do you think France should do with these territories? Leave us your answer below in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button. All the best, and I'll see you next time.